A U.S soldier and a British service member are dead in northern Iraq. Officials are calling it a training accident. But the timing, the location, and the wider regional chaos around Erbil Air Base raise a much bigger question. What happens when a so-called training zone sits inside a region already moving toward war? Let's think it through, because we need to be clear from the beginning. US and UK officials have described the deaths as a military training incident. They have not publicly released full details, and there is no confirmed evidence linking the deaths to an Iranian strike. But serious analysis does not stop at the official label, because this did not happen in a quiet country, far away from military pressure. It happened in Iraq, at Erbil Air Base, inside a region where the United States, Iran, Kurdish authorities, Iraqi politics, militia networks, and Western military presence have been colliding for years. And this is why the story matters. Not because we should invent facts before the investigation is complete, but because when Allied troops die at a military base in a region already surrounded by escalation, the world has a right to ask what risks are being carried in the background. Later, I will show you why Iran does not need to defeat the US military directly to make Washington's position in the region harder to sustain. It only needs to make the base network more dangerous, more expensive, and more politically toxic. And that is where this story becomes much bigger than one tragic incident. The official line is limited. 1 American soldier, 1 British service member. Erbil Air Base. A training accident. Investigation ongoing. But this is not just about what happened on the ground. It is also about how both sides are using this moment to rewrite the rules of the conflict. Washington says it is acting in self-defense. Tehran says the United States has violated the ceasefire. And that language matters, because whoever controls the language gets more room to escalate while blaming the other side. If Washington says self-defense, then its strikes become protection. If Tehran says ceasefire violation, then its response becomes retaliation. Note that it's the same battlefield, producing 2 completely different stories. And between those stories sits Iraq, again exposed to the consequences of a war it did not fully choose. This is where people need to look beyond the headline. Iraq is not only Iraq in this crisis. It is part of the military geography that allows the United States to operate across the Middle East. Its bases, airspace, logistics, intelligence, radar, training sites, refueling routes, and host state permission all matter. That is the hidden infrastructure of American power. And Iran is now trying to make that infrastructure feel unsafe. That is why Tehran's warning to regional countries was so serious. Iran is not only warning US forces, it is warning the countries and territories that host the systems behind US force. In simple terms, countries hosting US bases may now have to realize they are not just safe zones anymore. They could become targets. In fact, they already are. And that changes everything. This is because America's power in the Middle East does not depend only on aircraft carriers and fighter jets. It depends on where those aircraft can land, where drones can be launched, where troops can train, where supplies can move, and where governments allow American power to sit. Think about that for a second. The very things that make the US powerful in the region are now the exact things making it vulnerable. That is why Erbil matters. Erbil is not just a place on a map. It is part of a wider network. And when deaths happen inside that network, even under the official explanation of training, it forces a bigger question. How safe are these bases now? How clear is the line between training, support, and active conflict? And how long can governments keep telling the public that the crisis is contained when the military map keeps expanding? This is where things get complicated. Iran does not need to win a conventional war against the United States to change the region. It only needs to pressure the network. If every US-linked base becomes a risk point, Washington has a problem. If Iraq starts questioning whether foreign military presence is pulling it deeper into confrontation, Washington has a problem. If Gulf states begin asking whether American protection is becoming more dangerous than protective, Washington has a problem. And if every host country starts calculating the cost of being associated with US strikes on Iran, then it becomes much harder for the US to move and operate in the region. That is the strategy Tehran appears to be pushing. Not just hit back, but raise the cost of hosting American power. Make the base network politically uncomfortable and force Gulf rulers, Iraqi leaders, and regional governments to ask whether neutrality is still possible when their territory supports American operations. That is the unspoken tension behind the Erbil deaths. Again, the official explanation may be true. A training accident may indeed be a training accident. But a training accident inside a tense military environment still tells us something about exposure. It tells us Western troops are still operating in places where the difference between training zone, support zone, and conflict zone is becoming harder to see. And that is one of the most dangerous features of this moment. Note that the Middle East is not becoming one clean battlefield. It is becoming a networked crisis. There is continued presence of US troops in Iraq, US bases in the Gulf, shipping pressure around Hormuz, Iranian warnings to host countries, Israeli operations in the region, militia networks watching for openings, Kurdish areas exposed to regional pressure, and governments trying to claim they are outside the war while hosting the systems that make the war possible. That contradiction cannot hold forever. Because when missiles fly, when drones move, when aircraft take off, when bases are used, and when soldiers die, the public story of limited escalation begins to fall apart. This is why the phrase training accident feels incomplete to many people. Not necessarily false, but incomplete. It describes the category of the incident, but it does not describe the atmosphere around the base. It does not explain why Western troops are still operating in a country exposed to U.S. Iran escalation. It does not explain how a ceasefire can exist while strikes, warnings, and military movements continue. And it does not explain how long the region can keep absorbing pressure before one incident triggers something much larger. That is the pattern to watch. The US says it is acting defensively. Iran says the ceasefire has been violated. It warns that countries hosting US bases will no longer be shields. Then troops die at a base in northern Iraq during a training incident. The official event is one thing, the system around it is another. And Liberation Lens is not only interested in the event, we are interested in the system. The system is telling us that America's Middle East posture is becoming more exposed. Every base gives Washington reach, but every base also creates vulnerability. Every host country gives the US access, and so they also become a pressure point. Every training mission may be routine on paper, but the regional environment around those missions is becoming less routine by the day. This is how wars widen, and not always with one dramatic declaration. Sometimes they widen through pressure points. A drone incident here, a missile strike there, a base alert, a shipping attack, a training death, a retaliation warning, a government denial, a market reaction. And suddenly, everyone is still using the language of restraint while the region moves closer to open conflict. So the question is not only what happened at Erbil Air Base, it is more about what Erbil represents. It represents the vulnerability of foreign troops operating in a region where the rules are breaking down. It represents Iraq's dangerous position between US military presence and Iranian pressure. It represents the wider problem of using other people's territory as the backbone of American power. And it represents the human cost that appears when geopolitical strategy meets real lives. A family in America has lost someone. A family in Britain has lost someone. That should not be reduced to a talking point. But neither should their deaths be treated as isolated from the region around them. Because if this crisis keeps moving in this direction, the next escalation may not begin with a direct attack on Iran or Israel. It may begin at a base, a port, a radar site, an airfield, a convoy, a training ground, somewhere inside the infrastructure that lets America fight from someone else's soil. That is the warning. The Middle East is not stable because officials use careful language. It is not peaceful because strikes are called defensive. And it is not contained because casualties are categorized as accidents. Stability means the system itself is not moving toward collapse. And right now, the system is under pressure. If this breakdown helped you understand why the deaths in Erbil matter beyond the first headline, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and watch the next Liberation Lens analysis on your screen. Hit the like button so more people see this analysis. Share this video with someone who still thinks the Middle East crisis is contained. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this simply a tragic training accident in Iraq? Or does it reveal the wider danger facing every base that supports US power in the region? This is Liberation Lens, where perspective matters, and where we do not just follow the headline, we follow the power behind it.